The Rosary is more than just words to recite. It is a compass guiding a believer's life. When the true purpose of this elevated prayer is lost, it risks becoming a meaningless ritual, devoid of its transformative impact on everyday life. Therefore, when approaching the Rosary, one must strive for sincere conversion, allowing hearts to open to divine love and aiming to transform one's life in the image of Christ. As one of the most powerful prayer tools in Catholic tradition, the Rosary reveals its authentic strength only when recited reverently and consciously, with a heart open to change. Pope Francis teaches that the Rosary is not merely a monotonous repetition of phrases, but a living path to spiritual transformation, an act of love intended to draw the faithful closer to God and to conform them to Christ. Each mystery contemplated in the Rosary encourages deep reflection on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, prompting profound changes within one's very being. However, like any spiritual practice, the Rosary must be lived, avoiding mechanization and its reduction to a mere formal duty. We have all likely experienced a profound weariness that even prolonged sleep cannot alleviate. This heaviness on our shoulders and all-consuming exhaustion penetrates deeper than the physical body, as if the soul itself is tired of worldly pursuits. It is precisely this state of spiritual emptiness that Pope Francis warns against, using words that seem simple but carry a profound spiritual meaning often unrecognized. He states, "Fatigue can come not only from the body, but also from the soul." And here many make a mistake. We believe we are stressed, overwhelmed by work and routine, but we do not realize that this fatigue undermines our faith, disrupts inner silence, and distances us from God. And then something much more dangerous happens. Soul fatigue silences prayer, and when prayer is silenced, heaven moves away. Pope Francis calls this spiritual weariness an exhaustion that robs a person of their inner sparkle, diminishes their zest for life, and most importantly, extinguishes the fire of faith. Surely everyone has noticed how, during such periods, everything feels impossibly heavy. Prayer becomes a tormenting effort, and attending Mass feels like a distant and burdensome obligation. The desire to seek God simply vanishes. But make no mistake, this is not just a momentary weakness. It is a cunning, invisible attack. The enemy infiltrates through the breaches of fatigue and seizes vital space until a person ceases to fight. An exhausted Christian loses vigilance, and when we are not vigilant, we open doors to danger. Therefore, Pope Francis strongly urges us not to ignore soul fatigue, for it can be the first sign that one is silently drifting away from God. The longer this alarming signal is ignored, the deeper the chasm becomes. Yet, there is still time to awaken, to recognize this fatigue not as the end of the journey, but as an urgent call for spiritual restoration. Few realize, but Pope Francis deems it important to repeat in his most powerful messages, when the heart grows tired, it ceases to be vigilant. What does this mean? It signifies that the enemy does not need immense strength to crush an exhausted person. He merely needs to wait, for one who is not vigilant spiritually falls asleep. Perhaps you have tried to pray on a day when exhaustion peaked. Words feel empty and meaningless. The mind wanders through labyrinths of thought, and the connection to the sacred seems distant and almost impossible. It is at this moment that the soul begins to close its eyes, and evil patiently creeps closer. Pope Francis warns that fatigue weakens the soul's guard, and when this guard falls, the doors of the heart remain wide open, without resistance, without prayer, without protection. How many temptations cunningly penetrate at such moments? How many wrong decisions are made simply because one is too exhausted to reason soundly? How many times have we said yes to the world and no to God, simply because fatigue deprived us of mental clarity? This is not merely about physical rest, but something far deeper, a state of spiritual vulnerability. Prolonged fatigue opens the doors to discouragement, which escalates into indifference, and indifference becomes the ideal ground for sin to grow unnoticed. Pope Francis teaches that the enemy operates in the shadow of fatigue. He does not provoke fear, but simply waits for a person to drop their guard, and in the silence of their exhaustion, he whispers doubts, resentments, and rebellion. Therefore, Francis urges us to remain vigilant even when tired, for spiritual vigilance is not about physical effort, but about awareness, surrender, and entrusting our weakness into God's hands. Fatigue itself is not a sin, but ceasing to be vigilant means abandoning the protection that comes from above. And when this happens, danger creeps in with slow but steady steps. Pope Francis warns of a type of fatigue even more dangerous than physical exhaustion, a weariness not visible in the eyes but felt in the very soul, a fatigue that does not steal sleep but silences faith. This refers to emotional fatigue, which accumulates gradually, beginning with disappointment and frustration. By the time one realizes it, they are already internally drained, without the desire to react, without the energy to dream, and without the strength to believe. The most terrifying aspect is that this fatigue does not arrive suddenly but infiltrates day by day, gradually eroding hope, confidence, and ultimately closeness to God. Pope Francis speaks profoundly of the inner erosion of the soul, a state where the heart loses its courage and the spirit, once unyielding, begins to doubt. Faith becomes like fragile glass. Divine promises seem distant and unreal, and everything that once served as a source of inspiration now feels like a heavy burden. This kind of fatigue is particularly insidious because, externally, a person continues to smile, attend services, and offer prayers, yet deep within, their light gradually fades. This is why Francis persistently urges, guard your tired heart, heal your wounded soul, support your shaken hope, for when the emotional state suffers, faith is also in danger. In such moments, many begin to drift away from spiritual life, not by conscious choice, but due to a lost sense of God's presence in their lives. The enemy of human souls, as Francis notes, finds particular pleasure in this state. He feeds on emotional exhaustion, knowing full well that when inner pain takes over, the soul loses its ability to react with its former strength. But there is a way out. Pope Francis teaches that the first step to healing is acknowledging and accepting one's inner weariness, and then turning to God with a sincere plea, with tears if necessary. For God is capable of healing even those wounds we cannot describe. If ignored, fatigue does not simply disappear, it progresses, changes form, and transforms into something far more dangerous: apathy. Pope Francis warns that a tired soul, deprived of proper attention, sickens in silence. This illness leads to a state where a person ceases to experience joy and pain, loses the desire to pray, and does not even feel sadness about the absence of prayer. It is a cold emptiness, a barren land where faith can no longer blossom. One begins to act mechanically, attending services without listening to the words, reciting prayers without feeling their meaning, looking at the sky and losing confidence that anyone is listening. This is spiritual apathy, which creeps in unnoticed, like a quiet shadow. Pope Francis calls this an internal paralysis, a state where the soul loses its capacity for movement and begins to live by inertia. A person no longer strives for God, but also does not deny his existence, remaining in a stagnant state, neither hot nor cold. This is where the real danger lies, as the enemy of human souls prefers precisely this temperature: lukewarm, indifferent. One who has stopped reacting no longer fights and cares about nothing. The Pope urges us to recognize the signs of apathy when prayer becomes a burden, when the Word of God ceases to touch the heart, when faith turns into a habit and no longer burns as brightly as before. Yet, there is a poetic way out of this state. Francis reminds us that God does not reject the weary. On the contrary, he comes to meet them. He knocks on the door of one who no longer has the strength to open it and waits patiently. He waits for a sign, a tear, a sincere whisper, "Lord, help me." For even in a state of apathy, God remains near, waiting for the moment to rekindle the flame that once burned so brightly in the soul. There comes a point when fatigue, pain, and discouragement cease to be fleeting feelings. They become breaches in the spiritual armor, and it is through these breaches that the enemy penetrates. Pope Francis speaks openly. Evil does not attack when we are strong. It waits for the moment a person falls to strike. This is how it operates. Evil does not need to knock. It waits for the door to be left ajar. With forgotten prayer, weakened faith, and a wounded spirit, a person becomes vulnerable. The enemy is not in a hurry, he observes, feeding on the silence before God. And when he realizes the soul is weak, he begins to implant foreign thoughts. You are no longer worthy. God no longer hears you. Why keep trying? These thoughts do not arise by chance. They are spiritual arrows fired against those who are spiritually defenseless. In a state of weakness, one loses the ability to defend themselves as before. This is when wrong decisions arise, ill-timed anger, a return to harmful habits, the desire to give up everything, not because one wants to, but under the influence of a moment of weakness. Francis reminds us that the enemy acts when a person stops fighting. He does not need to overthrow. He simply waits for a person to cease resisting. Therefore, even in weakness, even when down, one must resist. Offer prayer, even if a whisper, read Psalms, even with tears in one's eyes, because a weak soul can still be protected if it is in God's hands. And what is particularly important, weakness does not disqualify a person, it makes them human. It is at this moment that God manifests his strength most profoundly, when a person acknowledges their fragility and turns to grace. Pope Francis speaks of something many prefer to keep silent about. Today, the loudest noise comes not from outside, but from within. We live surrounded by voices, demands, distractions, but the most terrifying noise is that which echoes in a tired soul. This internal noise prevents us from hearing God's voice. And many, confronted with this noise, try to flee from silence. Because silence exposes, it lays bare the wounds we try to hide, reveals the emptiness that distractions attempt to fill. A tired soul cannot bear silence because in it there are no masks, no excuses, only truth. Pope Francis warns, fleeing silence is fleeing oneself, and one who flees oneself risks fleeing God. Sometimes, the inability to tolerate silence indicates a deep inner need for healing. Instead of heeding this call, people often flee, filling their lives with busyness and distractions simply to avoid encountering what is truly important. as a result, one loses direction, the inner voice is silenced, and the ability to recognize signs sent from above diminishes. Pope Francis emphasizes that it is precisely in silence that God speaks, comforting, guiding, and strengthening. But how can one hear him if they constantly avoid silence? Perhaps the soul is exhausted from battling silence, for every time the world quiets, fears and pains surface. Instead of facing them with faith, one prefers the noise of social media and other distractions. However, healing begins with stopping, with immersing oneself in silence, even if with fear, uttering the words, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Silence is not emptiness, but a sacred space where God reveals himself, always awaiting a person's return to him. Pope Francis reminds us that even saints experience fatigue, but none of them gave up. Fatigue is a natural human condition. It weighs down and exhausts, but it should not define one's destiny. A true believer is not one who never weakens, but one who, even when weak, continues to cry out to God, lifts their head, kneels, and with a trembling voice says, "Lord, I am here." The enemy fears not the strong, but the persistent, those who, even wounded, continue to move forward, disregarding obstacles because they are focused on what is promised. Perhaps you're exhausted now and want to stop, but if a spark of faith still flickers within you, that is enough to rekindle the flame. Pope Francis calls for spiritual resistance, stating that victory often lies not in conquering, but in not yielding, not giving up, not letting go of God's hand, even when everything seems hopeless, when prayers seem unanswered, when the soul is overflowing with sorrow. It is at this moment that faith becomes real, not the faith expressed in beautiful words, but a quiet faith that resists in pain, that prays persistently, that moves forward without seeing the path. And then heaven is moved, because God never abandons the weary but faithful person. He draws near, supports, and renews them. Pope Francis concludes that one who continues to move forward, even when tired, is closer to glory than they realize. You may be wounded and exhausted, but if you are still here, it means you have not yet given up, and that is already a miracle. There are fatigues that sleep cannot cure, pains that time cannot heal, and burdens that only one thing can alleviate: rest in the Lord. True rest is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of God, not fleeing from problems, but finding a place where the soul can breathe. Christ himself extended an eternal invitation: "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. This is not just an appeal, but a refuge, a promise, a place where the soul bows to be lifted by divine hands. Resting in the Lord means not stopping, but surrendering oneself into the hands of the one who sees all, understands all, and forgives all. It means stopping trying to solve everything alone, releasing the chains of pride and saying, "Lord, I cannot, but you can." How many times do we try to carry the world on our shoulders, forgetting that God offers us rest, not a fleeting rest of distractions, but a rest that heals men's wounds and allows us to start anew. To rest in the Lord is to close your eyes to chaos and feel peace, to not have all the answers, but to trust, to release anxiety, to silence internal screams, and to acknowledge that life does not need to be perfect for God's presence to be in it. Pope Francis says that only those who allow themselves to rest in God can rise with strength that comes not from the earth, but from heaven. And this strength is needed now. There is no need to fight alone. to wander aimlessly, to suffocate your soul in human attempts. You need to spiritually bow in the Father's hands, open a space in your silence for Him to enter, and say, "Here is my pain, my fatigue, my exhausted soul. Please take care of me." Ultimately, resting in the Lord is the most powerful way to continue. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but an act of courage and humility. One who does not learn to ask for help risks falling and remaining fallen. Many drown in silence, believing that bearing everything alone is a virtue. But this is pride disguised as strength, and pride distances us from God. Christ, being the Son of God, did not face everything alone. He wept with friends, was supported by Simon on the way to Calvary, and received comfort from Veronica. If even he accepted help, who are we to refuse it? The adversarial voice whispers about isolation, cautioning against interaction, and suggesting that any engagement will only hinder. It calls for a display of strength and silent endurance. However, as Pope Francis emphasizes, the Holy Spirit guides us in a completely different direction. He calls for trust and openness of heart, reminding us that humanity was not created for solitary struggle. The Church, according to the Pontiff, represents a unified community, a living organism where each member supports the other. When the soul is exhausted, it is crucial to seek help from a fellow believer, a priest, or a praying friend. One should not keep pain to themselves or carry an unbearable cross alone. Asking for support does not diminish faith. It only strengthens the connection with God. When two or more unite in prayer, heaven responds with particular power. As biblical wisdom states, "Woe to him who is alone when he falls and has no one to lift him up." Ecclesiastes 4:10. Do not be ashamed to admit your need. The words, "I need help," can be the starting point for healing, rebirth, and reunification with God. Heaven is always open to those who ask. God is attentive to silent tears, but acts even more powerfully when He sees hearts ready to open. Pope Francis calls for sincerity, for letting go of masks and opening one's heart to those who can offer support. If today you feel at your limit, do not pretend. Asking for help can open the path to the miracle you have long awaited. Consider, might weariness not be an obstacle, but an opportunity for God's intervention? Pope Francis teaches that God chooses not the strong, but those ready for action. Often, exhausted by fatigue, we feel far from being chosen. However, human understanding of weariness is limited. We tend to think that God uses only those who are full of strength and seem invincible. But it is precisely in a state of weariness that God's grace manifests most brightly. In moments of weakness, God empowers us with strength that surpasses our own capabilities. Recall biblical examples. Moses, burdened by the responsibility for his people, was used by God to liberate Israel. David, a youth weary from battles, became a king chosen to lead his nation. And who could have imagined that Jesus, weary and wounded, would become the Son of God? Jesus chose not the most powerful and wise, but simple and tired fishermen, transforming them into his disciples. It is important to understand that it is not fatigue that disqualifies us, but devotion that makes us worthy. Pope Francis emphasizes, the Lord chooses the weak to show his strength. Fatigue is not the end of the journey, but an opportunity for a deeper manifestation of God's grace. Every tear, every effort, every moment of weakness, these are chances for a unique manifestation of God's glory in a person's life. Perhaps you feel exhausted now, but do not give up. It is precisely now that God is ready to use you. Your struggle is not in vain, and your fatigue is not a sign of defeat, but a symbol of preparation. God is near, supporting and choosing you. Fatigue is a human condition, but divine strength is something supernatural. Even a tired person can be chosen, and everyone, even when exhausted, is a masterpiece in the hands of God.